Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we'd like to get started. I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I want to apologize. We have multiple programs, so I'll say just right up front, if you're here for human trafficking in Asia, you're in the wrong place. You're in the auditorium, and I think we may have some transplants come over from their meeting with the same start time. I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I direct the Environmental Change and Security Program here. And on behalf of my colleagues in the Latin America program, we're thrilled that you've all joined us for this session. We're very fortunate to have the minister come from Costa Rica. It is a real thrill that Carlos Manuel Rodríguez has come to talk about Costa Rica's leading activities in the area of conservation in ecosystem services, and I will also encourage him to riff on some of the points that he made at the Commission on Sustainable Development meeting in New York this spring on bridging the worlds of conservation and development, even in a place like Costa Rica, where we think of, and rightly so, as a country that's really on the forefront and leading these efforts. He can still tell us about some of the challenges that it pose there. For those of you who might be new to the center, the Woodrow Wilson Center is actually the former memorial to Woodrow Wilson, founded in 1968 by Congress as a nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum to bring together the worlds of scholarship and policy. The Environmental Change and Security Program does that specifically in the area of environment and health, development, and broader foreign policy and even security policy. So we're thrilled to have this discussion here today. We do it in the form of meetings and then publications, which I hope you will pick up outside the room. We want to thank particularly Lisa Handy and Conservation International for working with us to make this particular meeting possible. It's been a terrific collaboration as usual with Conservation International. We really appreciate that opportunity. As I mentioned, Mr. Rodriguez is going to tell us about some of his thoughts and insights on financial mechanisms in conservation and ecosystem services. He has a distinguished career in addressing these issues, and so is certainly an appropriate person to be talking to us about it. He's an environmental lawyer from Costa Rican University and Southern Methodist University. He's the founder and former president of the Ecologist Federation of Costa Rica, former director of the National Park Service there, and also former vice minister of Environment and Energy before becoming the minister. So I will turn the floor over to Carlos for today's address.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and I'll thank everybody for coming this afternoon. I know everybody has responsibilities and a lot of work to do, and I'm very, honored and pleased that you take time out of your responsibilities to come here and share with me a little bit about a vision that I want to go in detail. But first of all, my name, as Jeff mentioned, is Carlos Manuel Rodríguez. I'm an environmental activist from Costa Rica. Now I'm the Minister of Environment, Energy, Mines, and Water. Seems like I'm a very powerful guy. But I will go in details to tell you some of the things around politics, policy makers, the governments, and where the major challenges are. We talk about sustainable development, and we try to conceive it through a system where we create technological alternatives that are going to help us to make everything sustainable. So we aim ourselves to try to look for a solution for pesticide use, and we try to do this and that, but we never think about designing the proper political institutions. We never think about creating proper conditions in governments in order to work towards sustainable development. And we are not going to be able to be successful in generating a healthy environment and a healthy society if we don't invest in governments, policymakers, and creating a good atmosphere for a better decision-making process. And I will, go throughout it in this presentation. Costa Rica is a country that has done quite an interesting effort around biological conservation. And I will go to this afternoon telling you like a history of the last 25, 35 years of Costa Rica and how we've been learning lessons in trying to make out the best out of these lessons. And explain you all the environmental payment mechanism that we have developed, which has been quite successful in the country, and I think that it needs to be analyzed and eventually replicated elsewhere because it's very successful. So Costa Rica was a big forest when Europeans arrived there, and we began to colonize it, basically destroying the forest. Most of the economic growth in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s were close related with agriculture and cattle ranching. In 1960, agriculture and cattle ranching produced 45% of the GNP. So economic growth was conceived as stimulating agriculture and cattle ranching. Even though scientists were telling us that the ecosystems were very fragile, the land use capacity of the soil was very limited, and that we should not develop an economic activity in those lands where the soils were not good for, traditional agriculture and cattle ranching. Even though science and academics were telling us that politicians and policymakers were stimulating agriculture and cattle ranching all over the country. So every single policy, and I won't read all of those things, you can do it yourself. Every policy, every government was stimulating the land use changes from forest to something else. That something else was pasture land, bananas, pineapple, coffee, thinking that that was the best way to promote economic growth and, a better life condition for everybody in Costa Rica. All the banking laws, credit laws, all the land tenure laws and policies, all the agrarian reform was aimed towards land use changes. And deforestation was the best expression of that land use tenure. If you own land and you want a credit from a public land, you were not subject to that credit if you had forest in your land. If you want title for your land, you cannot acquire title and ownership if you have forest in that land. As a matter of fact, there were laws that taxed those farms with forests because forest was a burden to development. Just 22% of the trees that were cut in Costa Rica got to a sawmill. The value of the forest was equal to nothing. Last year my grandfather died, 97 years old, and when I talked with him about these things, he said, Carlos, you're right. I remember, I bought, our farm. My grandfather said, I bought it in 1942. And I'm a third-generation coffee producer. So I bought a 400-hectare farm full of forest for coffee production. So I did some soil analysis, and I found out that just 60 hectares out of those 400 hectares were good for coffee. So I chopped down the forest, planted coffee, and I kept the rest of the farm with forest. In 1962, my grandfather said, Congress passed a law that established a tax on unproductive lands. An unproductive land is a land with forest. So instead of paying a tax for my unproductive land, I decided to tear down the forest, and develop a dairy operation which I never had an experience. And I had a dairy operation there rather than paying taxes. So I went to buy chainsaws, I went to buy a bulldozer, and I found out that there were a lot of subsidies. They never charged me for taxes. There's a subsidy for fuels and parts. Everything was conceived to destroy the forest, change the use of land from forest to other things. My grandfather destroyed 300 hectares of that forest into pasture land. And it is very interesting. That was in 1962, 1963. Today, all that land that was used as a pasture land is a forest now because we've been paying environmental services based on those services being given. And it wasn't very interesting to see in my lifetime how things has changed dramatically. But basically, all the policies and stimulus in Costa Rica were aimed for deforestation and the change of use of land. Here we can see the amount of forest we have in 1940. It was 75%, in 1950, 72%, 61, 53%, 77, 31%, 83, 26%. 87, 21% of the country was with forest. So this is the picture of what happened in Costa Rica. We call this the Striptease of Costa Rica because it lost all of the cover and we got to a very, very critical situation. In 1969, we began, a group of people with the country, a group of people began to try to stop and revert the process of deforestation because there was a lot of scientists and science behind telling everybody you should stop that because those economic activities, farming, through cattle ranching and agriculture, are not going to be sustainable. And there's not going to be an economic profit out of those land uses in the long term because the ecological condition of the soils and the ecosystems were very delicate and fragile. We should stop that. Well, we began in 1969 creating national parks, trying to understand the underlying reasons behind deforestation. And you know, we try to simplistically blame a lot of people the responsibility of deforestation. We blame the timber industry. We blame cattle ranchers. We blame this and that. But you know who's the responsible? Responsible are governments through their rural development policies, promoting land use changes, promoting the expansion of the agricultural frontier, and producing deforestation. A couple of months ago, I was in Alaska in a conference, and a very famous scientist was telling everybody that agriculture was the biggest threat to biodiversity. And after his speech, I went and I correct him, and I told him, you know, it's not agriculture the main responsible or threat to biodiversity. It's the Minister of Agriculture. Yes, it's the Minister of Agriculture with his vision of development, promoting the expansion of the agricultural frontier, destroying the forest, deforesting the land, not putting attention to scientists and experts about critical ecosystems conditions, and trying to give land to the poor, give land to the farm, open new areas for farming. And that's what's going all around the tropics nowadays. So, and also, everybody knows deforestation is bad. And we morally reject deforestation, but it is legal everywhere. In every single country of the world, deforestation, understand it as the land use changes from forest to something else, is legal. So, what is the fuss about it? I mean, everybody complains it, but nobody does real thing. Nobody put the finger where the problem is, and it is a political problem. It's not a technical problem. It's a political problem. Well, Costa Rica began drafting laws and trying to revert the process of deforestation, began designing the protected national park system, and tried to design a system to stimulate, financially stimulate tree plantations and forest conservation. And we began this long, long process of trial and error. At the beginning, we designed a system where we established an exemption for income tax for those who plant trees. But farmers, especially small farmers in the tropics, they don't pay income tax. So at the end of this first stage, the ones who were interested in planting trees were corporations, which do pay income tax. Corporations that didn't have an expertise or an experience in forest. They sell computers, they sell cars, they work in textiles, and they were interested in this good tax shelter, which they use it to plant trees, but they didn't have a major commitment toward forestry or tree plantations. So the government tried to change it and establish another system where they subsidize tree plantations. So they went and stimulated the payment of a subsidy for those who plant trees. And it went in a good way to a lot of small, and created a lot of small farmers organization, but we had a major ecological problem because this stimulus was stimulating deforestation. You clear-cut the forest and plant exotic trees. We went from an old-growth tropical forest on an average of 100 species per hectare to plant 3 or 4 exotic species. And that was something terrible in the country, so we began, I won't go into the details, but we went to a long, tedious, and very hard learning by doing process until the early 90s where we began doing something interesting. In this system of subsidies and direct payment for doing something in the forestry sector had a major political problem. Every year, we had to go to the Minister of Finance and almost beg him to assign the resources that come from taxpayers to pay the subsidy for the forestry sector. And it was very complicated, very inefficient in political terms, and it was very costly to the government. So around 92, 93, the government took a decision to stop all subsidies, artificial subsidies to the exportator sector, to tourism sectors, to the forestry sector, in trying to change rule. At that time, we were planting a lot of trees, probably not the best species, not in the best places, not with the best practices, but there were a lot of tree plantations all over the country. And we decided that 2-3 decisions were very important. The first one was this one, the abolition of the change of use of forested lands. That means Congress in the early 90s established deforestation as something illegal. Nobody ever can chop down his forest into something else. And if you have a forest, you are condemned for eternity to have that forest on your land. That was a major decision for Congress. But it has to be complemented with something because we cannot enforce and comply that regulation through the traditional way, which is the traditional way, an armed park ranger or an armed forest service official trying to put every small farmer, every indigenous community that needs to survive out of the use of land to keep that forest there. So we designed something that was very interesting, which was the creation of a funding source for environmental service payment. Everything come into an idea when in 1994 there was a big problem around a timber company that planted trees high in the watershed and was going to harvest those trees in a nearby place where there was a water catchment for a local community. So everybody in the local community downwards were complaining why they're going to cut the trees in a nearby area where water was accessed. And the Ministry of Environment went there, tried to mediate in that confrontations, and I remember I was in the National Park Service at that time. We had this big meeting, and everybody was complaining against the company who planted trees in order to be harvested. And the guy who owned the farm where the trees were planted was complaining why they didn't allow me to cut the trees if they are not paying me for the water I'm producing, or why you guys, instead of blaming me as a bad guy, why don't you buy the trees in order to be kept standing and giving that environmental service? So from that day on, a lot of things began to happen in Costa Rica, and we began to conceptualize a system where everybody who is benefit by an environmental service based on a land use should be due compensate, financially speaking. So the concept is very simple, and we conceptualize it in the forestry law that says that forest plantation, and other ecosystem provide essential services to the people and economic activities at the local, national, and global level. So there should be a payment for environmental service. The payment for environmental services is the mechanism implemented to pay the owners of the land, the above, mentioned service provided to society. We began doing some research, and we found out that there's around 25 different environmental services being given by tropical forests in Costa Rica. So we grouped them in 4. Water, greenhouse effect gases, biodiversity, and landscape beauty. So the principle was very simple. Those who has a forest, no matter the size, how big or how small, they generate an environmental service to somebody who is using it and not recognizing the financial value of that service. So we passed a law that established and recognized these 4 environmental services, saying that every owner of a forest or a tree plantation and now a agroforestry system that generates environmental services should be paid by the beneficiary of that environmental services. And the government is there in the middle creating the conditions in order to that transaction be done. So the environmental services payment program is a private transaction within the private owner of the forest and those who are users of those environmental services at the local level. So the first thing we did was, well, there's a greenhouse effect or a carbon sequestration environmental services being done by forests. So everybody who uses fossil fuels in Costa Rica should pay private owners of forests for this environmental service, which is carbon fixation or carbon sequestration. So what we did is that we put a tax on fuels that goes to a special fund that is a private-public organization in Costa Rica. We put a tax of 1.5% of the market value of every single fossil fuel that goes to a fund that generates between $10 to $12 million a year that is used to pay for the environmental service of carbon sequestration at the local level. Before this, we did a study to try to value all of these 4 environmental services. And that study told us that the real value of those environmental services is between $150 to $330 per hectare per year. So, well, we began internalizing each one of those 4 environmental services. The first one was carbon sequestration. I told it as a very simple action, but it is very complicated, especially in the political arena. Try to go to your president and ask him to put a tax on fuels to pay carbon sequestration, and you will understand how complex and difficult it is. In Costa Rica, on the contrary, society is really committed towards environmental conservation, and society is receiving good rewards of a long-term effort of biological conservation, and everybody is really sensible to those things. So in a country like Costa Rica, these kind of things can be done the proper way in the proper time. And I remember in '96 when we went to President Figueres' office and told him about this idea. And he said, I like it, I'm going to support it. We went to Congress, we fight in Congress, we fight a lot of people, and in less than a year, we were able to fully internalize this. So we began a program. Another thing. We pay $50 per hectare per year for carbon sequestration. Why $50? Because if we had a estimate of around $150 to $300, we divided 50 each. We say it's $200. We will pay eventually $200. When I go and tell this story to our friends of the World Bank, they always jump on us and they say, oh, you're wrong because the economic theory tells something different. You shouldn't do that. Yes, we know we are far away from what the economic theory tells us, but this is politically feasible and it does work. And now we're doing adjustment. After 10 years, we're doing very interesting adjustment. So we began paying $50 per hectare per year. We know that we can generate $10 to $12 million a year, but that was not enough for us to really begin strong and to consolidate a major effort. So we designed a big project. We call it EcoMarket. EcoMarket, which is a Costa Rican government, GEF, and World Bank project in order to achieve those objectives. And essentially, what we wanted, that was on year number 3 of this program. In year number 3, we began with EcoMarket, and it is a big project. It's a $50 million project that is ending next month after 5 years, where we have not a grant, a loan from the World Bank, $32 million, a grant from GF, $8 million, and a counterpart from the Costa Rican government. It is interesting that when we approached the Minister of Finance in order to have his approval to assume a credit with the World Bank of $32 million, again, it is a major political challenge because in every single poor country of the tropics, competing in accessing credits with major priorities like schools, healthcare, hospitals, roads, bridges, dams, sports is very difficult. And many people are very unsuccessful because policymakers from the financial sector, they don't see environment as an important thing. Why? Because people from the environmental sector doesn't know how to speak with them, doesn't know the language they know, and we don't have data and information to show them in a cost-benefit relationship how good an investment on this is. And in Costa Rica, we've been learning this language. Now, I'm going to show you in this presentation how we learned that way. Because the only way we knew how to approach the Minister of Finance was trying to represent the big problem we have in the environmental sector and trying to be very emotional and hoping that he will cry in the middle of the meeting because of what we've been telling him. And Ministers of Finance are like reptiles. They are cold-blooded, and they don't react to those things. They are like reptiles. Yes, they have no emotions because that's their work. They are numerical driven. They need information, and we found out that we were very unsuccessful. But at this time, it's very interesting because we were very successful to give good emotional arguments in order to compete with that window of opportunity for external debt. And we were able to conceptualize this project, which is ending. And, well, this is the major objective. Our major objective is to have added funds to put it into the same fund of the tax on fuel to have more resources based on those objectives that we had designed from the government. So, by 2004, and we had, well, in 2005, we have 500,000 hectares within the program, just paying $50 per hectare per year for carbon sequestration, which is not really carbon sequestration. This is a simple way to express something more complicated. What we pay is avoid deforestation. Because carbon sequestration in forest, which is 86% of the land that is in the program, there's a big, and you all know, discussion about how much carbon sequestration a forest, tropical forest does. We know that we are not going to advance in that discussion. What we are paying is avoid deforestation. And we know that where we pay environmental services for carbon, we avoid deforestation. And so, well, 86 to 90% it is forest conservation, and the rest is tree plantation and agroforestry systems. And, well, the fund has 80%, 85% of the tax on fuels and other sources. And these are the results of the EcoMarket project. We went way before, 500,000 hectares is a lot of land in Costa Rica, where the country total area is 5 million hectares. So we have 1 million hectares in national parks, in protected areas, and we have 500,000 hectares of the country within this program. That's a lot of land within the country. So we surpassed by far our targets of EcoMarket. We're way beyond the 100,000 hectares during those 5 years. And we began to prove and internalize other criteria or areas of interest. One was the gender participation of women in this program, we found out that there were a lot of small woman-owned forests in Costa Rica based on the agrarian reform program, or for whatever circumstance, there were single mothers, a lot of single mothers owning small patches of forest. That was a priority for us. So we went from 200 to 1,600 farms or women. Another was indigenous community. This is a very interesting example of something that we've been realizing lately. We passed from less than 5,000 hectares to now we're around 35,000 hectares in Indian reserves, paying for avoid deforestation or environmental services being given by them. And in Costa Rica, indigenous communities are the single biggest owner of land. They own around 450,000 hectares of forest. So when I make my numbers and I see the future, big winners are indigenous communities in Costa Rica. This is me around 3 months ago in tiny reserve where I went to pay them for that year's environmental services. And I asked them, show me what you did with the money we paid you last year. 55 new homes. 55. It's new school. Here I am giving a 52,000 check to them for that year's environmental services, and all the community was there. And they had very clear what I was doing there. I was not giving a subsidy. I was not giving free money from the central government. I was paying them for environmental services just being given the year before. Now the problem is try to organize and trade them to financial administration and other things, because now I see that as a major problem. These are the kids I saw that day. That picture was taken by me. And these are going to be experts in selling environmental services in Costa Rica when they grow up. When they grow up, their reserve is going to receive, based on my estimation, within $7 to $9 million a year annually. That's a lot of money. At this time, we have put in Indian reserve around $3 million, and it does make a difference. When I see the environmental service payment program paying for avoid deforestation, and when I go to a community like this, I say, my goodness, this is poverty alleviation. The best example of poverty alleviation. Why don't we change things? Why don't we, instead of thinking on biodiversity as we have done all my life or our life, work through poverty alleviation in order to achieve protection of biodiversity and a lot of other things. So we began to think and mix a lot of feelings and thoughts. And now, after 10 years of this program, we have what we call the second generation of environmental services that I'm going to show you a little bit later today. So Indian Reserve environmental services is a wonderful mixture, an excellent example of how we can approach some of the poorest and more poorest communities and more difficult areas to deal with, because central governments always focus on the same instrument, on the same mechanisms. And these people are very wise, and they do understand things. You know, one of the most important things I saw that day, for the first time since the creation of the reserve, which has 45, 50 years, the local timber owner, the local owner of the sawmill, didn't buy timber to the Indian Reserve, because the Indian Reserve sell their timber in an exchange of a repair of the local road. So the local owner of the sawmill, that dry season, didn't have a way to transact his the Indians' timber based on repairing the road, because now they had the money to repair the road without selling the trees. And he was very, very upset with us because he didn't have a way to access the timber from the Indian Reserve based on giving as an exchange a way to repair the road, because now the indigenous community doesn't need money because they had the money to repair the road. So for me, it was also very interesting, some of these side effects. So I've been talking about what we did in the last 8 years. 2 years ago, I began a very complex next stage where we were going to internalize our second environmental service conceived in the forestry law, which was water. Remember, until this point, we only pay $50 per hectare per year for carbon sequestration or avoid deforestation. Carbon sequestration in tree plantation, avoid deforestation in forest. So 2 years ago, we began thinking in water. Water is an environmental service being given by tree plantation, agroforestry systems, and forest. National parks in Costa Rica are major water factories. As a matter of fact, they produce a lot of water for hydro production. Costa Rica has a very good record on renewable energy. 98.6% of our electricity is generated by renewable sources, water, geothermal, and wind energy. And half of the water used for hydro production comes from national parks. And if we want to produce the same amount of energy produced with water from national parks based on oil use, well, it will cost around $420 million annually. That's the benefit of having those water factories. But nobody pays me for the water production in our national parks. So we began a system where we are now internalizing the ecological cost of water in all public services. So every user will pay the ecological cost of water. Every user, public and private. And we have a lot of users in Costa Rica. This is in Spanish. I wasn't able to translate it all totally. But basically what we did was, since I'm the Minister of Water and I gave water concessions, it was very easily the beginning stage of this process. So every user of water has to have a concession and pay for that concession. When I was assigned as minister, I gathered all the guys from the water department. I told them, I want you to explain me what is the criteria to assign the fee, the water fee, the access fee. And everybody began scratching their head, and all of a sudden somebody raised their hand and said, it's an historical criteria, he told me. I knew that there was no criteria. And I pulled them to work, and I told them, I want to know what is the real ecological cost of water, because when we pay a public service based on water use, irrigation, energy, drinking water, what we are paying is the cost of producing that service. But we don't pay the water cost. And there's an economic cost in producing water and keeping those watersheds producing water. So we got to a number where we found out that a cubic meter of water values around half a cent. So what I did was two things. One, went to talk with my president and told him, we're going to do something where I do need a lot of political support because everybody's going to jump. Costa Rica is a place where there's a lot of water. The per capita disponibility of water is the 8th in the world, so we're high there. So in a country where there is so much water, probably over-exploited water, and there's not a real value to the water because it's a free access resource. So I knew everybody was going to jump because I was going to increase 2,000% the water access fees. Well, it was 2,000%, and one of the first things I did was go to the president, and the president passed what we call a presidential resolution. And he said, all public institutions who use public water rights for a public service will financially recognize the ecological cost of water. So the president was there with a lot of pressure, everybody telling the president, you're supporting this crazy minister of environment who's wanting to increase access fee 2,000%. I mean, how can you keep that guy right by your side? Because he's going to broke us and a lot of things. So this is what we had before. This is the actual value of water rights. This is in colones. And the average is 0.0007 cents of a colon. $1 is 400 colones. So if you try to translate this into dollars, you need to look for a PhD in economy to make the numbers because I'm unable to do that. But basically, the price to access water was probably zero for all purposes. And I was going to go from this average into a differentiated system to water human consumption, industry, commercial and agro-industry, tourism, agriculture, aquaculture, and hydro. So I went from a lot of point zeros to much more than that. And it took me 3 years to go through a very complicated political process dealing with every of the 17 different subsectors using water, with some of them very easy because there were, open-minded people that understood very quickly the concept of the water factory. And when I approached for example, the industrial sector uses a lot of water. And I told them, this country has invested a lot in water infrastructure. Millions of dollars in hydro dams, in aqueducts, in irrigation. But we haven't put a dime in the water factory. And you operate factories, you know how important it is to do proper maintaining in a factory. This is not a tortilla factory, this is a water factory. And the concept is the same. We need to invest in that water factory. That water factory is a private forest, it's a shaded coffee, it's a national park, it's an agroforestry system, it's a pasture with trees. Those things produce water, and we need to invest in those land uses. So you need to pay that added cost that reflect the ecological cost of water into a system that really compensates that environmental service being given by private owner of forests or national parks. So after 3 years, I was quite successful to be able to negotiate something that ended like this. I was unable to fully charge the real price of the ecological cost of water. I was able to negotiate 40% of the real price. And it will take me 7 years to go to that 40%. So every year I will increase 10 to 15% until I get to year number 7. But when I get to year number 7, I will generate $25 million annually for a system that is going to be reinvested in the same watershed where the water is catch or captured. So I'm complementing the carbon with water to pay environmental services. Now we're increasing from $50 to probably $92 or to $100, depending on different land uses and how those land uses are good for water production. And that's in a study that we're ending. But basically, what we're doing is, here's a map of Costa Rica. You don't see it very well, but what you see very well is areas of importance for water conservation. We got a lot of information on how we can prioritize and efficiently invest those resources in water services. We need to invest in water monitor and control insight for water rights and illegal uses. We need to invest in watershed management. This is a national park. From this national park, we take water to give drinking water to more than 500,000 people, and it generates 150 megawatts of energy based on the water that is generated in this water factory. And nobody pays me nothing for that service. Now, this national park, by year number 7, and the budget, hear this, the budget, I have the annual budget for operational. This is 67,000 hectares. The annual budget I have, besides salaries, is less than $2,000 a year. And this water factory is going to generate, by year number 7, around $1.7 million a year, just charging water. By year number 7, I will double the budget of the National Park Service, just charging the water from the national parks. My budget for the National Park Service is around $6 million. By year number 7, by charging the water, I will double the budget from the National Park Service without knocking the door of the Minister of Finance, without knocking the door of the World Bank, without knocking the door of CI, TNC, WWF, without knocking the door of anybody, just charging the real price of water. And this is quite a solution for us based on our actual problems. So water is going to be an instrument also to move towards another agenda that is very important for us, which is the agricultural agenda. There's a lot of good uses of land for water production, like this farmland where we have pasture land with trees. We have found out, based on our studies, that 40% of the animals you see in a national park, you see it in a cattle ranch where there's trees, live fences or pasture land with trees. So there's a lot of important environmental services being given by productive activities outside the forest. And one of our major challenges in Costa Rica is how to merge the agricultural and environmental agenda in a common vision for sustainable rural development. When I was president, I'm going to tell you a little anecdote. When I was president of the ecologist movement in Costa Rica, in 1991, we had a major problem because there was an expansion of the banana farms in a forested area. And at that time, deforestation was legal, so a lot of banana companies were destroying the forest to plant trees, bananas. So we had this major big farm, and we gathered there in the farm with a lot of media and the press and the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Environment at that time. And it was incredible to see 400 hectares of a forest down in the ground because there was going to be a new banana farm there. So we were there in the middle of a swamp with the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Environment, and the media asked the Minister of Agriculture, what is your impression of what we're seeing here? And the Minister of Agriculture says, this is the cost of development. Costa Rica is one of the best producers of banana in the world. There's going to be a lot of jobs. There's going to be a lot of money. And he gave a 10-minute speech. After he finished, the media, the press, turned around and asked the Minister of Environment what's his feeling about what we were looking at there. And he said, this is an ecological catastrophe. This cannot happen in Costa Rica. I will sue everybody and I will go to court. And there we were in the middle of the swamp, scratching our heads and thinking, these two guys are ministers. They're part of a team. But they are not part of a team. They confront a lot. Agriculture and environment in the tropics, there's a big confrontation. And through a mechanism like this, we can merge both institutions, both agenda in a common vision for sustainable rural development, which is something that we are doing in Costa Rica. This is the map of the protected areas in Costa Rica. This is after 35 years. We have done our share of biological corridors here, 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 and there. We still need to do a lot of biological corridors. But still 13% of the land within National Park is privately owned. We need to buy them out. That's $50 million worth. We have done such a good job to assign proper value to the land with forest that it has come to be very expensive, the land with forest in Costa Rica. And we cannot access international resources because we need to compete with Congo Basin or Amazon Basin or Mexico. A hectare of forest in Costa Rica, the value of a hectare of forest in Costa Rica is between $750 and $3,000 a hectare. In Mexico, it's $25. In Brazil, it's $4. So we cannot go to the Nature Conservancy and tell them, why don't you go to Costa Rica to help us buy land? They want size. We cannot compete. How can we pay that land, and how can we do this? This is the map with all our future biological corridors, where we're going to pay the land with the money we charge for environmental services, water production, biodiversity, which is something that I'm going to talk a little bit later. And we don't need to buy a single hectare outside protected areas to make this map come into reality, because that is what we've been doing. We've been paying environmental services in all of these private forests which are linking now all of the national parks. Also, many people tend to think that national parks are unproductive areas, especially the agricultural sector. Unproductive areas? You're very, very wrong. Costa Rican protected areas generate $834 million a year annually. That means 5.5% of the GNP. all of a sudden, we come to realize that in Costa Rica, national parks produce more than our 4 major exploitation crops. Wow. We said, there's a lot of things that we should do. So we began to do a lot of economic analysis on what we produce based on the use of those environmental services from national parks. So when I present this study to the president and my fellow ministers, everybody was very happy, besides the Minister of Agriculture, because he thought he was the champion in producing things in rural areas, and I proved he's not anymore the champion. Nah, he's a contender, not the champion. And I told him, and agriculture produced 7.7, national parks 5.5. This is the language the Minister of Finance does understands. I don't need to go and try to make him cry anymore. I go to the Minister of Finance and I tell the numbers because we've been evaluating things. Now we're negotiating a $70 million Eco-Market 2. We're finishing Eco-Market 1, which is a $50 million. Now we're negotiating a $70 million Eco-Market. So I went to the Minister of Finance because I needed his support. We are going to have a loan from the World Bank of $33 million, and the country is going to put a counterpart of $30 million. So I went to the Minister of Finance, and I told him, the environmental services, this, environmental services, that. And he said, Carlos Manuel, don't talk me and explain me about environmental services because my farm is in the program. So this demonstrates how we've been able to spread the system and the payment everywhere where it has become socialized, and everybody knows the program, and everybody understands the concepts very, very clear. So this is the map of Costa Rica in '98 with the farms being paid for environmental services. This is last year, almost all of the country. We are unable to fully satisfy the annual demand. We only satisfy 22% of the annual demand. We have 500,000 hectares in the program, 670,000 hectares waiting in line to be paid, but we are unable, with the tax on fuel and what we are charging for water, fully satisfy that demand. So we begin to establish priorities in how to focus the resources. So we began to mix a lot of things. Before we used to conceptualize this financial mechanism to protect biodiversity and stop deforestation. But we learned that there were a lot of other things. Water was one major important. This is rural water supply system, where they are, and how we can link this water supply with a forest that produce water. This is watersheds. This is water catchment, underwater water catchment, underwater catchments, swells, wells, where they are. We have all that information, so we put those layers of information in order to prioritize. This is very important for me, low social development index, where the poor of the poorest live in Costa Rica, and how if you put this in the forest coverage map of the country, you have the same areas. So we're paying environmental services where the poor of the poorest are. We have done a lot of studies and tell us something that for me is very important. The payment of environmental services signifies between 10 to 30% of the annual income of 80% of the beneficiaries. It does make a difference for many, many people. Well, this is other information, Kyoto lands. So going back, remember the Striptease of Costa Rica? Look, 87, just 21% of the country with forest. Look what happened. This is 97. We went from 21 to 42. And if you see this area, let's go back. There was no forest in the tropical dry Pacific. Now, there's a lot of forest coming. Let's see, 2000, 45% of the countries with forest. In the 2005, it's just been taken out of the oven, and it tells us that, and I don't have it in this presentation, it tells us that 52% of the country now is with forest. Costa Rica is the only tropical country of the world where every year forest increases and fire decreases. The contrary is what we see in the rest of the tropical world. Because they don't have, even though they now kind of understand the concept of environmental services, they don't have instruments to try to revert this process. Because, for example, the other day I had a meeting with the Secretary of Environment of a state in the Amazon, and he told me, Carlos, we've been doing a great job, a lot of new parks in the Amazon. And he showed me this map with 5 million hectares, the size of my country, of protected areas. He was very, very happy, and I told him, and what is your plan for the forests outside protected areas? And he went silent. He doesn't have a plan. Those forests are going to disappear because there is no plan beside the well-known instrument of protected area as an instrument to protect the health of those ecosystems that give us a lot of environmental services. So I told them, guys, you should wake up in Brazil because you're always afraid of the international community taking control of the Amazon. That's that's not a reality. You should establish a system where everybody at the global level should pay for the environmental services being given by the Amazon basin forest. And now Brazil is beginning to try to change a little bit that attitude. So we have carbon and greenhouses, gases being internalized and being paid. Now we have water. What is the next one? The next one is biodiversity. The water was launched around 3 months ago, even though we had some pilot cases for the last 6 years. There's 6 micro watersheds in Costa Rica that for the last 6 years, a private hydro operator with the government are paying environmental services to small local farmers within the micro watershed for water production. And our experience is very, very successful, very interesting. And it's very simple. Where you pay for water production in the watershed, you don't have deforestation, because even though deforestation is illegal, sometimes there's illegal deforestation. So whenever you pay for water production and carbon fixation, there is no deforestation. Where there is no deforestation, there is no sedimentation into the river. Where there is no sedimentation, the cost of production of a kilowatt decreases. Sedimentation is one of the biggest financial burdens to hydro operators because they need to clean up their dam or their hydro operation. So we pay for water production in 6 watersheds. And I will tell you another anecdote. When we began this program 6 years ago, local farmers, which are very poor, were very suspicious about the government paying for something very water. Water is free. Why they are going to pay us? They thought that we were going to purchase their land very, very cheaply. So we had problem accessing and incorporating local farmers into this program. So I looked for a leader within the community. So I went to Mario Alvarado's farm, very poor guy, in a very steep terrain. So I went to his home and I asked for Mario. And his wife told him, he's down there working with my sons. It took me an hour and a half to get where he was working, and he was chopping the forest to plant bananas and beans, basically a subsistence activity. So I talked with Mario, I explained him, a lot of guys follow up me, and he was the first one to went into the program where he was paid for water production around $62 per hectare per year, half paid by the hydro company, half paid by the government to the tax on fuels. And I visited him around a year ago, after that first encounter. And when I visited him, he was not working down there in the field. He was sitting in his house reading. And I said, hey, Don Mario, do you remember me? I'm the guy who came here many years ago. I said, what are you doing? I asked him. He said, I'm studying. He's 52. I'm studying. Why you are studying? Because I never went to school. I know how to read and write, but I never went to school. And now that I produce water, I have a lot of free time. I need to dedicate to something else. And where are your kids? My kids are in school. And I saw energy, electric energy. I saw a TV. I saw an electric kitchen. I saw a lot of improvement in his home. And I come to realize this is the best example of poverty alleviation through a environmental financial instrument. And of course, what he has done producing water has been very interesting. So the same thing we've been doing, those micro watersheds, now we are doing it all over the country. So we internalize carbon fixation, we internalize water. Now we want to generate an experience in biodiversity. Biodiversity, the biggest industry in Costa Rica is a major user of biodiversity. That industry is called ecotourism. It generates $1.5 billion every year. And even though many of those users of biodiversity doesn't know that they are a user of a biodiversity, we at the Ministry of Environment, we know who they are, where they are. We don't know how to charge for that environmental services because many of the users of biodiversity never put a foot in the forest. The owner of a restaurant, the owner of a bus, the owner of the lodge, the owner of the airplane, the owner of the taxi, the guy who sells the food to the lodge. I mean, there's a lot of people who works around the ecotourism industry that they depend on a healthy ecosystem that provides landscape beauty and biodiversity. Even though we can adjust the entrance fee of the national park based on the cost of conservation of that biodiversity, we want to design a national-wide system where we can charge every user of biodiversity. So since it is so complicated, we began through a pilot case. And this pilot case is in Nosa Peninsula. We have this national park, and there's another national park, and we have this biological corridor. That corridor is all within private property. Very small, very poor farmers that all of them are represented here. Those farms in green and light yellow are within the program. They're being paid for water production. They're being paid for carbon sequestration or avoid deforestation. And it is very successful. What we are doing, and this is that biological corridor, beautiful area, pristine forest, all with a small, very poor farmers, that they don't have a lot of alternatives to produce something and sustain their livelihood, besides the payment of environmental services, which is between 10 to 30% of their annual income. So what we have done is pay them an added value for biodiversity protection, and we use the jaguar. This is a picture taken with those new camera laser technology in one of these three farms. So these farms with red colors are farms where we know jaguars, there's a presence of a jaguar. So we're paying around $72 per hectare per year for carbon and water. There's very low uses of water here, so the water payment is very low, but there's a lot of biodiversity here. There's a lot of people that says that in an area like this, there's no place in the planet with such a high biodiversity. So we know jaguars are present here, so we're paying $15 to what we pay for carbon and water for jaguar presence there. So all of a sudden, a jaguar that was a nuisance, is how you say, to them, becomes something positive. As a matter of fact, 6 months ago, a farmer here around one of these farms, the latest one into the program, I think is this one, told me, you know, Minister, I'm going to buy a lot of pigs in my farm so the jaguar can prey on them, and you can pay me for that jaguar presence. All of a sudden, jaguars became something positive out of something negative. Now we're going to, and this, where the money comes from, were lodges around here, and in this area, that in a voluntary commitment, we have gathered $1.3 million. We have a small fund of $1.3 million. There's money from CI being allocated there. There's money from the Nature Conservancy being allocated there. There's money, potential money from the Moore Foundation also put there that are going to complement the payment for biodiversity in this area. We're going to pay for jaguar presence. We are going to pay for endangered trees, and we're going to pay for endangered orchids to begin to generate a new mechanisms where we can assign financial value to those endangered species that there's no value to them. There's no real market value for them, and that's why we're losing them. Why do cows are not going extinct and whales are going extinct? Because there's no value to a whale, besides capturing it and killing it and taking it to Japan so it can be eaten. And a cow does has a lot of value, and the owner of the cow will keep an eye on that cow. So if we assign a value to an animal like a jaguar, we will protect the jaguar forever. So, and the experience is very interesting because we are going to begin this next ride season a survey on jaguar population, and I bet you all that the jaguars are going to increase dramatically. So after this experience, last year we began a project where we need to scale up in mainstream environmental services, and this is what we call the second generation of environmental services. We know that throughout these 10 years, environmental services have done all of these things. We measure them. We know for sure that they do that. We want them to do now these things. We want to use this instrument that it was conceived to protect forests, to avoid deforestation, to protect biodiversity as a major tool for sustainable rural development, where poverty alleviation is a major element. So, we want to pay environmental services to all of the positive activities in the landscape. Here we have a national park. That national park is being paid for the environmental services being given. We have a tree plantation over here. The owner of that tree plantation is being paid for those environmental services. We have agroforestry systems, shade coffee, live fences, water production, soil erosion control action, organic agriculture, you name it. There can be a lot of things that can be done. We have a pilot case in an area like this one. This is a GEF project where we pay environmental services to cattle ranchers based on increase of biomass, increase of biodiversity, and increase of water conditions in their farms. And what we do is that we go and make a recipe to the farmer. This is a small farmer, and we tell him, you can increase biodiversity, you can increase biomass, you can increase water production, and at the same time increase cattle production if you do this. And we give him a recipe. It will cost you $25,000. We give you a loan for that $25,000. But you don't have to pay me back in dollars. You pay me back in environmental services. For us, environmental services is as good as $1. So we go next year and we measure the additionality in biomass, in biodiversity, in water conditions, in soil conditions. And this project has been very successful. Now we want to jump towards that experience and begin to stimulate and transform those traditional productive activities within farmlands into something really more sustainable that can incorporate the value of those common services and goods with the production of environmental services being paid by those people who receive those environmental services. So we have now a very rich mixture of many layers of criteria to pay environmental services. Here we have biodiversity. Here we have carbon sequestration. Here we have degraded lands. Here we have water. Here we have indigenous communities. Here we have single mothers. Here we have poor people. A lot of things all together merge in new criteria, a new way to envision how we should promote sustainable rural development in a country like Costa Rica. So when you see this map, where we've been transforming the country from a highly deforested country into a highly forested country, we think that this is something that does work. This is something that does help the country improve life conditions in rural communities. This is something that helps the country to be able to increase economic activities. Forested areas are not competing with cattle ranching and agriculture. We're dedicating forested areas where the land condition and the ecosystems allow them to be where any traditional economic activity is not profitable. What is our lesson? Our lesson is that we should aim all our effort to be able to generate a very positive equation where we can have economic profit and ecological profit out of the use of the land. And this is something that we all should focus ourselves, because most of the human activity based on land uses are aimed basically for economic profit. But they don't come to realize that after 1 year, 10 years, 50 years, or 100 years, that economic activity is going to collapse because there's not an ecological consideration behind the land uses. And in Costa Rica, we've been understanding this and being able to gather a momentum and try to conceptualize a new financial mechanism that goes way beyond our environmental agenda. This is something that goes beyond nowadays. This goes beyond my agenda. This is something that has become something from the social agenda. Because 2 years ago, I went to the Social Council. The Social Council is the president, 8 ministers, and 7 other public agencies in charge of poverty alleviation. And I told them, I request a meeting with them. I told them, you know, my fellow colleagues, I've been putting through this mechanism $17 million annually in rural communities, and you don't see that. You don't see me. I'm like an invisible person to you. How come this is a reality? So I began to work with them, and the Social Council all of a sudden began to develop specific methodologies to measure the impact on poverty alleviation based on this mechanism. And they have found out that we are so positive that now we became, the Minister of Environment, a formal member of the Social Council within the country. So all of a sudden, something that was aimed and conceptualized to stop deforestation and protect biodiversity has transformed in something way beyond our expectation into an interesting instrument that uses environment as a good way to alleviate poverty in our country. Just to finish my presentation, I need to tell you that this is a reality in Costa Rica, because at the same time we've been investing in the political institutionality we need in the country to really make these things come true. We, as I told you, we have a Ministry of Environment that has environment, energy, mining, and water. I don't have a Minister of Mining in front of me to fight with, or a Minister of Energy wanting to oil drill my parks. And when I see the challenge, the global challenges, and I see people expecting that this eventual global collapse we're heading towards, when I see people that think that some scientist one of these days is going to find the magical solution to our problems, and they expect science and technology to resolve our problems, I tell them that they are very wrong. What we have in our hands is a major, major political problem, because I don't see a strong world leadership within our leaders. When I'm in Costa Rica and I see to the north, and I see President willing to drill wildlife refuges, when I see to the south and I see President willing to drill in Amazon national parks, I come to realize that we have a major political problem there. And the institutionality behind that decision of that president or that government is not properly designed to have a good, sound, cost-benefit information for a better decision-making process. If you see how head of states take decisions, they take decision within willing to have an impact in a 4-year term, willing to have more money and more votes at the same time. No president is going to take a political cost on a decision so the impact can be seen 25 or 30 years after his term. And that's because we haven't invested in the political institutionality on one side, because we have ministers of energy, minister of mines, minister of environment, all spread in the government without a consistent line of policy making. And at the same time, most of the economics And the mechanisms where we measure the economy and the health of the economy doesn't internalize those positive and negative externalities. We pollute the river, we destroy the forest, and that doesn't reflect in the economic analysis of our government. So the Minister of Finance will never, ever put attention to environment because it doesn't reflect in their numbers. And until we change that, we are not going to be very successful. At the same time, we haven't invested in what I believe is the most important thing, which is investing in social values. Costa Rica is a country that really, really has strong social values. It's a country without an army. And we've been able to be very successful without an army. We haven't had a war in all our independent life, more than 180 years. We didn't have an army to defend ourselves. And since we abolished the army 60 years ago, we passed from 52% of our population under extreme poverty circumstances to less than 18% nowadays. We began to invest in social care, we began to invest in education, and when you invest in our richest resource, which is the human resource, you are able at the same time to improve things like things in the environmental agenda. And when I see what is going all over the world, where for example, Security Council in the UN, who are the members of the Security Council? The country with the biggest armies, the country with the biggest armed business in the world. Those are the guys who set the rules for everybody. And I think that until we began to change social values and we began to educate our people and commit themselves for democracy, for liberty, human rights, and the protection of the environment, all the rest, the economy and the political sector, will come into action altogether. And this is basically the experience that we've been having in Costa Rica, where we've been able to grow based on a strong environmental agenda, where the Minister of Environment is strong and can be right next to the President, speaking to his ear to compensate the traditional decision-making process. So here I finish. Thank you all for your time, and I hope that you enjoy my presentation.
Minister Rodriguez, I don't know where to start because it was so tremendously rich in terms of the material you covered, and really, frankly, such a optimistic message, but in the hard, cold terms of economics that, as you say, the broader audiences that we need to bring into this process, the finance ministries. I want to throw it open for discussion and just ask that you let us know who you are before you pose your question. So who would like to kick us off? Yeah, Chip.
I'm Chip Barber from USA. I'm Chip Barber from USAID. It's a pleasure to hear you talk again. I almost didn't come because, as you remember, I was down at the meeting in Costa Rica when you spoke, and it was a wonderful presentation, but I thought, I wonder if he's going to talk about the same things. And I said, well, that was really good. I'll go again. And I was amazed to see how much has happened just since April and all these things, which is very impressive. My two questions are you still enemies with the Minister of Agriculture now? And how are things going in terms of this current situation? How does agriculture fit into this whole system? And the other is looking at the transnational aspects of payment for environmental services, because a lot of people will say, at least in this government and in others, that this is great in the domestic context, and we think it's a great thing, and countries can generate their own resources, and they can be used for poverty alleviation. When you start to talk about transboundary things, people get much more uncomfortable. They envision China charging Southeast Asia for the water in the Mekong River, and these kind of transboundary issues of upstream and downstream. And I was curious what your perspectives were on that.
Well, thank you, Charles. With the agricultural sector, we have this hate-love relationship nowadays. It used to be hate-hate. Now it's hate-love relationship because on one way, the environmental services payment program is a strong ally from the agricultural sector. Now farmers, and also in Costa Rica, most of the people who own land has a piece of forest, a piece of tree plantation, a lot of pasture land, some crop land. So I have a good mixture of a little bit of everything. And they've been receiving payment for forest-related activity. Now that we're moving towards the farmland and the rural landscape, paying other environmental services, they see themselves as big winners. And they want us to move ahead and merge that agenda of agriculture and environment. And we have a formal process through a program that is being financed by FAO, World Bank, IDB, and other agencies where we have this program that we call conservating by producing and producing by conservation. So it is going well in that direction. Our hate relationship is when the Ministry of Environment is stepping on the toes of those who generate a lot of negative externalities. You know, we've been telling the guys from the agro-industry and the agricultural sector that they've been socializing a lot of those environmental costs, and they should assume that environmental cost. And they jump in front of you, and they had a lot of power. And I had to deal with that circumstance. The other day, the Minister of Agriculture, just to give you an example, in a meeting told the President, you know, these guys from the Ministry of Environment are getting involved in everything. They should keep themselves in the park and let us do what we know to do outside the protected area. And he proposed the President, you know, we should change the environmental legislation in order to be adapted to our agricultural reality. I got the message very clear from them. And they don't want, in Costa Rica, the agricultural sector is very conservative, very reactive to those things, and they see the Ministry of Environment as a something bad that is against their competitiveness. Other sectors, other economic sectors, now bigger than agriculture, because agriculture was big in the 60s, 40% of the GNP were generated by them. Now you saw it's just 7.7%. Other sectors which are important for us as tourism or industrial sectors are very committed towards environment conservation, and they have been accepting the internalization of some of those negative externalities that we're proposing, because this is a program where we internalize positive externalities. At the same time, we are in the pollution agenda, we're internalizing those negative externalities, and we have a lot of problems, a lot of problems. But we have good political evidence and conditions to really do a very objective discussion in how we should channel our effort to curb that productive process in the agricultural sector to something more positive, where we generate a lot of information based on the cost of not doing nothing, doing business as usual. I've been doing a lot of research, Charles, on the cost of water pollution by the agricultural sector, and it is very high. So I go to the Minister of Finance and I tell him, you know, this is the cost of not doing nothing. I go to the President and tell them this is the cost of producing pineapples, cattle, cheese, milk, whatever. And if we don't do something, we will be in major problems in the next few years. It is very difficult to deal with them.
Bill Mansfield, and then just in front of him. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, that'll be fine. No, that's all right. No problem. You got the mic. That's all right. No.
Mr. Minister, Bill Mansfield from the United Nations Environment Program. I think it's a remarkable story that you're telling, and in a way, one of the first times that you see the environmental community, or an environmental community, moving into getting the economic benefits out of the environment, which has been one of the weaknesses in the whole sustainable development effort. But I'm wondering, to what extent are you in the position now to begin to tell other countries what you're doing so that others can emulate them if they choose to do so? And I think that would be very important to get this kind of word out so others can see the advantage.
Okay. Before answering your question, Charles also asked me, how can we go globally on this? I do agree that going globally out of nothing is very difficult. And I think that we should go country by country and region by region. In Costa Rica, it's very easy because it's a small country. Everybody knows everybody. We have a lot of information. We have a strong human resource there, and we have been able in 10 years to do a lot of things. If we think of Brazil, a huge country, the U.S., huge country, we should focus in some areas or some watersheds, and from there spreading it all over. And I don't think that we can get, Charles, to a global system until we went through a country-by-country effort. When I talk with my friends from the Amazon basin and they want to put a tax on international price of oil, I told them, no, wait, we need to do something more on the local level than going there, because conditions are not there to do that. We need to generate conditions. We need to educate people in order to go there. Bill, I had the fortune to have 23 ministers visiting my country watching this process. Many ministers from tropical, poor countries, and they always say to me, oh, I want to do this in my country. What can you advise me to do? And I told them, the first thing you have to do is to understand that you need to generate conditions outside your environmental agenda to set things in the proper direction. And the most important thing, way beyond any other thing, is political stability in your country. This means that not only that you have to avoid violence and wars and civil wars, that's elemental, but when a government changes from one to another, you should keep people, you should keep policies, and you should keep an agenda. When I became, my institution has 1,300 persons. When I became a minister and I went into office, only 3 people changed it. The minister, the vice minister, and the general administrator. I keep everybody there because those are the only that those has a political positions, and I need to work with all the technicians and everybody. If I go to Nicaragua and I see what happens when there's a change of government, everybody changes. You cannot invest in human resource, you cannot invest in your institution, and that's because there's not a lot of political stability or mature political processes where one government can change from another. Also, what we have done here, we haven't done it in the last 5 years, we haven't done it in the last 10 years, even though this program was conceptualized 10 years ago. This means 35 years of effort to stop deforestation through a lot of bad decisions, to a lot of learning by doing, a lot of trial and error, but being very consistent in going, trying to be innovative in doing this and doing that. That's true. That's the reality behind it. Those many ministers, especially I had the pleasure to have some ministers from the Congo Basin, and of course from the Congo Basin Partnership, and they get very anxious and very stimulated by what we have seen here. And I always tell them, if you set conditions, you need time. You need to invest in people and invest in the institutions. The Ministry of Environment of Costa Rica has a budget bigger than the rest of the Ministry of Environment of Central America altogether. We have more people working in my ministry than all the ministers of Central America altogether. That's because we began 20 years before any other country in the region. Well, eventually, everybody, I hope, is going to get and level right next to us. Then there's another problem, Bill, which is I don't have resources to do a good, strong South-South cooperation. And now that my 4-year term is going to end very soon, I want to dedicate a lot of time to build conditions in order to access resources to be able to strongly design a local national capacity to go abroad and help many of the countries more than what we can do now.
I'm Jim Bass. I'm an environmental economist currently working in several other countries in your region. That last figure, by the way, was something that I would have guessed at, but it was nice to hear confirmed. I had 2 questions. One was just taken care of. The other is that in carbon sequestration, you discussed only domestic carbon sequestration. Are your carbon credits internationally tradable?
Yes and no.
Could you elaborate? And if so, I'd like a follow-up question, possibly.
Well, before the approval of the Kyoto Protocol, we had a lot of excellent and very interesting voluntary negotiation of carbon, all of them basically within the energy sector. And we've been very successful. We have a good voluntary negotiation with the Norwegian government, with the forestry sector, but basically in the energy sector. Now, after the approval and coming to force of the Kyoto Protocol, we have to deal with many of the problems every single country is dealing, is the really complicated mechanism around compliance of the Marrakesh guidelines, not only in the land use activities and to prove it, but also on the administrative level. Costa Rica is not promoting a lot of carbon businesses at this point, and is expecting to see things, because we believe that it's better to wait a little bit than commit yourself very easily and very quickly until we see better conditions. But what we are focusing now ourselves strongly is trying to open the possibility to discuss forests in the carbon business. You know, forests are not included in the MDL, and I believe that Costa Rica has proved that if we pay environmental services, we can avoid deforestation. And even though the discussion should not be how much carbon is being fixed or sequestrated by a forest, we should discuss that if we don't assign a value rather than the value of the timber to the existing forest, those forests are going to disappear. As a matter of fact, they are disappearing at a very high rate, because the owner of the land need to produce something. They take the timber, they chop the rest of the forest, and they plant soybean, they put pasture land because they need to survive and do something. And in Costa Rica, we have proven that in many parts of the country, selling environmental services is as or more profitable than traditional cattle ranching and agriculture. In 70% of the country, where ecological conditions and land and soil conditions are not good for cattle ranching or traditional agriculture, selling environmental services within $50 to $90 per hectare per year is more profitable than those other activities. So we are part of this Papua Nueva Guinea Rainforest Coalition that wants to take as much the opportunity to begin to discuss forests within a framework post Kyoto, or if we have the possibility to include it through any possibility that we can expect after this next Montreal meeting next month.
All right, well, quickly as a follow-up then, and I don't expect this to be an elaborate answer because obviously it can't be right now, but since you've already monetized a lot of the flows within the country, have you already started calculating what types of international balances you'll need in order to be able to put your credits on?
No, we haven't. No,
you're not thinking that far ahead.
No,
and hence you've not had the intra-ministry or inter-ministry conflicts you'll run into on that one.
Yes. What we are doing now is trying to design a system where the payment really differentiate the value of the environmental services. And now we're putting more attention with what our friends from the World Bank, a lot of good theorists tell us, has been telling us for a lot of years, because we've been playing by ear a lot, playing with political circumstances, and the system is working. Now we need to tune it and begin to make it more efficient. Now we want to make a system where we differentiate the quality of the environmental services being given by land uses. So we can differentiate different environmental services within water production, differentiate environmental services within carbon or biodiversity, and try to establish a system that does stimulate a better quality of environmental service.
I'm Roger Hamilton from the Inter-American Development Bank.
As a result of what you've done, a lot of ordinary, average Costa Rican citizens, I guess particularly in the urban areas, are now paying more for water, for electricity, for other things. And I'm just wondering, why hasn't this become a terrible political problem, during election years?
Yes, well, it hasn't become a terrible political problem because the increase in those public services is minimal. The increase on drinking water in the 7-year adjustment process is less than $1. And in energy, it's like $1.50. So it's not a political issue. And people, there's a will to pay. I mean, remember that I've been telling that common citizens are committed to environmental conservation, and we have done our surveys, and people are willing to pay if we guarantee them that that money goes directly to the source of the production of the environmental services. They always tell us, yes, we want to pay, but you have to guarantee me that that money doesn't go to the government payroll or to other things. And the system has proven to be very efficient in how we recollect those payments and how we allocate those payments.
Well, you said that Costa Rica has made a considerable investment in social values, and this, I would presume, would be the result of that. How did you invest in social values to create this kind of an investment?
Well, I think that we have unique circumstances in a country. Costa Rica was the poorest of the Spanish colonies within Central America. No gold mines were there. No big indigenous communities were there. So people never had an interest in going to Costa Rica because they had an interest, European, in those countries where there are a lot of minerals and a lot of free labor hand, indigenous communities. So most of them went to those countries, and a very small, rich, high class exploded in the use of mining or in other natural resources, those indigenous communities. And from then on, from the colonial times to today, that social differences to manifest in very different ways. On the contrary, in Costa Rica, there were no rich, and everybody was very poor. So the society evolved around a strong solidarity system where everybody has to work strongly to be able to survive. And when the first economic activities developed in the early Republican days around coffee production, the initial government designed some policies to reinvest those resources in education and healthcare. We never had an independence war. We knew we were independent a month later after the formal independence, because it took a month, a guy in a horse from Guatemala to Costa Rica to tell us that we were independent. We never had a civil war. Well, we have a small civil war. In 1948, 123 people died. That's nothing to actual civil war standards. So we developed a very strong solidarity society with a big influence in the U.S. Constitution. We have a major influence in the U.S. Constitution. And those values around liberty, human rights, were strongly developed in a country that we believe that non-violence is what we should aim for, and the resolution of the problem should be done through the law and through the institutions. So when you have those things there, and there hasn't been any confrontation within brothers and cousins, you have excellent conditions to move ahead and put new values into that social component.
Len Hirsch?
It's a unique situation, of course, yes.
Hopefully others can learn from you. Len Hirsch from the Smithsonian. Thank you, as always. Two things. One, the distribution of the benefits. Have you done any analysis of who's actually getting the payments and where you may need to work and tweak on that? And the second is, I guess also has two parts to it. I'm assuming a lot of the reforestation and growth is on peripheries of agricultural land. Are you even looking at other ways to create services from agricultural land, not necessarily from forests, but from no-till agriculture that helps build up soil, that helps with carbon retention, which helps with water retention, and finding some payments for new agricultural services? And if so, do you expect that there might be any WTO compliance problems with additional payments to agriculturalists and potential problems from the WTO?
Well, we did a very general study on the social impact of the environmental payment program. It was very revealing to us. What we found out was that we need to do more of an in-depth analysis, and since we are now a formal member of the Social Council, and the Social Council is trying to develop a new methodology to internalize the benefit of this mechanism, there we will have a lot of ground to work based on the impact in poverty alleviation and the social sectors within the payment of the program, and it can generate a lot of information so we can enrich the criteria to assign resources. Regarding the agricultural sector, yes, we've been working for the last 3 years developing new mechanisms to recognize environmental services within traditional farming, especially agroforestry systems based on increase of biomass and biodiversity, and we've been trying to conceptualize a mechanism where we compensate for additionality. And eventually we will pay environmental services for organic production and other things that we are willing to develop in the Eco Market 2 project with the World Bank, where we want to upscale and mainstream some of these instruments. I don't think we will have a problem with WTO because this is not a subsidy. This is a payment for a service. We need to educate people, yes, within the country and outside the country. We are paying for an environmental service. For me, an environmental service is like selling a service, like selling a banana or selling a cow. It's a non-traditional way of using the land under economic producing system. So yes, probably people may think this is a subsidy or this is a barrier to free trade, or I don't know. But based on my concept, I think that we can have good arguments to teach and educate people.
Okay, gentleman in the back.
My name's Davis Jones with the Environmental Protection Agency next door. A fascinating discussion about payment for services from land and forests. Have you thought about charges for damages, specifically for pollution of water quality, damages of water quality or air quality?
Sure, and we've been studying and watching the European and the U.S. experiences in those elements, because this is part of a approach to fully internalize positive and negative externalities. The thing is that we've been able to work with the more positive of both agenda, which is internalizing positive externalities. When you deal with the internalization of those negative externalities, whatever we pollute, we just step on a lot of toes, and many of those toes are difficult to deal with, politically speaking. But yes, now we have a discharge fee, a fee for discharge in water sources. In Costa Rica, 80% of the water discharge does not comply with water quality standards. So we have two options. One is closing down all of those industries, which is not an option, politically speaking. If I propose that, I will probably not be a minister next weekend. And the other is to design a long-term mechanism where we can internalize that cost and finance those solutions, because you know better than me that the problem is not at the end of the tube, is trying to transform the production line within the industry. In Costa Rica, most of the pollution, water water pollution is now the major environmental challenge. And the problem is that my institution, my people, and everything is well trained for these things. We confuse environment and biological conservation. What we do in Costa Rica is biological conservation. Even though my ministry is called Minister of Environment and all those other things, it should be called Minister of Biological Conservation. 3 years ago, I set new rules and new policies and new priorities. And now, these issues are not our highest priority. Our highest priority is focusing ourselves to generate political conditions and to present technological and financial instruments to revert in a long term the pollution problem. So we had a proposal to establish a fee on discharge based on water quality, which has been very controversial in the country. Agricultural sector, big enemy. They want to keep that business as usual attitude, and they are not going to be able to sustain that attitude a few more years. I know that, so I don't push it too hard because there's going to be a back effect on me. There's a couple of initiatives to establishing green taxes on non-returnable and disposable things for the soft drink industry and the beer industry. And there's a lot of political will in Congress to establish it because we need a lot there. But yes, we know that we need to move to create conditions to fully internalize those negative externalities based on the industry and agro-industry.
Ma'am, and then Jesse in the red, and then come up front.
I'm Catherine Parent from the American Chemical Society. You touched briefly on recognizing the National Park Service and the forests as factories for water production and carbon sequestration, and the revenue stream that you're generating through your program. Could you talk a little bit more about where you see that money being reinvested to improve the quality and quantity of those resources? Okay.
At this point, well, basically, the principle is very simple. Every payment of environmental services is reinvested where the environmental service is being given. So in water, we have water concessions, superficial water concession, groundwater concessions. So the monies that goes through the water concession is reimbursed directly in the same watershed. That was a basic negotiation element within water users. They don't want me to subsidize somebody else. That's obvious. And that even though the payment of those services is not based on the real value, because we haven't got to that point, because of many reasons, we pay something that is politically feasible within what the conditions are now. Now that we have 10 years of doing this, now we think that we can move dramatically towards a differentiated systems where we can, differentiate within carbon and water. We can conceptualize what is the real value of carbon and water in this watershed based on these other elements. So we can establish a system where we stimulate those better services. For example, if now I pay the same amount of money for carbon sequestration to an old growth forest or to a secondary forest or to a degraded forest. But the services being given by those land users are very different. The ones being given by the old growth forests are good in quality. And those others are not so good in quality. Now we're moving towards a system that we pay a differentiated, to do a differentiated mechanism to pay better for those who give a better service and stimulate those others that doesn't give a good service to do it eventually if they can improve ecological conditions in their land.
Jesse,
First of all, thanks for your very interesting presentation. My name is Jesse Buff. I'm with the National Cooperative Business Association, and I'm interested in the payments and how they're dispersed, and also what would make someone choose to act based on this payment to conserve resources? Because to me they seem kind of low. I wanted to take the example of the jaguars. I've actually done work with jaguars in other parts of Central America, and it would seem to me that $72 a year, I believe, is the figure that you quoted for conserving jaguars or having them on your land. That would seem a bit low to me, especially if you're losing cattle to jaguars. So that I was just wondering, also in a communal situation, particularly in the indigenous reserves areas, how the money is dispersed and how some people, if they're getting communal benefits but not personal benefits, why someone would choose to act to conserve instead of trying to seek material gain through cutting a few trees or something like that.
Thanks for those questions. Those are questions that we make ourselves every day. We don't pay the cost of opportunity. And yes, probably in many areas, harvesting the timber within your forest is way more profitable than receiving a payment of environmental services, the way we do. But you have to have in mind that many of those private forests receiving between $50 to $70 per hectare per year are funds dedicated to ecotourism. Many. Many others that probably are not under a ecotourism activity, many of the people, based on our surveys, are people that feel that eventually those forests are going to be paid way more than those other alternatives, and that probably that money are going to be their retirement fund or the funds they use to finance the school or colleges of their kids. But above all, my conclusion is that the level of poverty in Costa Rica is not as high as other countries where those farmers need to cut the tree today to eat tomorrow. 99% of the Costa Rican has easy and free access to medical care. Nobody needs to have an insurance to have an open heart surgery or a treatment. 97% of the people has access to energy. 98% of the people has access to communications. Costa Rica has the best road distribution, not the quality of the roads. Terrible. But the best web net or road system where everybody can use the road with a lot of problems, but everybody can use the road. And there's a lot of public services being given to them. So those are unique conditions in Costa Rica. You don't see them in many other countries. So when you have those conditions, just 18% of the people beneath the line of poverty, where the average in Latin America is 50, 60%. And when you go to rural communities with forests, probably that 50% turns into 80, 90%. That's my conclusion. Those other elements contribute to generate conditions. Once I asked a person why you are in the program when you can timber your forest and have it more profit. And he told me, this is my retirement fund. People expect to gain more eventually. They know that the system is going to better recognize the financial value of those environmental services, and they are there. Also, most of the beneficiaries are small and medium farmers that do have other economic activities within their farm. They have coffee, or they have a couple of cows, and they have this, and they have another. They complement it. Also, in indigenous reserve, we pay environmental service for communal areas. They invest those resources in communal interest activities, like drinking water, schools, home repairs, as I presented in my presentation. Well, thank you all. Have a good night.
Yeah, no, thank you very, very much. And I was remiss in not saying before, for those of you who want to share the minister's presentations and insights with colleagues outside the room, we've actually been webcasting this meeting live, and that video will be archived and on the website along with a summary of the meeting. So we urge you to share that. Come to the Wilson Center website and share these insights with colleagues so that they can benefit from them as well. Thank you so very much. Thank you. That was really terrific. In fact, we have a short briefing paper series. Perhaps if it's okay with you, what we'll do is make a transcript and maybe send you some stuff and see if it's something we can then put out in a kind of nice.
Of course, I would like to. Thank you.
Hola, ¿cómo estás? Sí, allá atrás.
No me digas.
Sí, llegó un poquito más tarde, pero ya la vi porque para evitar que confirme. Me voy porque tengo una reunión a las 6 de la mañana, pero por lo menos ya te vine a ver. Cualquier cosa me llamas, ¿verdad?
Sí, cómo no.
Bye, bye.
I guess, whatever, at least, I'll find Andy, okay, let's,
I'm talking with also with Adrian.
culture for weeks and all my
Well, we're very, very, very happy and stimulated by your grant. We are today. You're all involved in that. Probably you guys from the consultation doesn't realize, but you're going to be the first one in the world to pay environmental services for biodiversity. That's something very important for us.
coral species, a lot of stuff.
I hope you can go one day to Costa Rica to see it in person. Ah, you've been there? Ah, okay.
Everybody has.